Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I guess we should canvass opinion on whether that was a good joke about tents or not. Actually, Peter Ashman, my friend and colleague from BMJ, told me that ALPS was a big tent organisation. I have to say I thought he was speaking metaphorically, but there you go. Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me this afternoon. It's occurred to me on the way here, I'm an English graduate, so I know stuff about poetry, and maybe not all of you are familiar with the quote that I attached to my speech, Waving or Drowning. It's from a very, very fine poem by Stevie Smith, who confusingly was a lady. And if you want to read the poem, please go to poetryarchive.org, and you'll be able to hear her speaking it. It's a remarkably good poem. But the reason I like that expression is it sums up that not quite sureness is, are the cheery waves that we're seeing from any particular troubled industry a symptom of cheerfulness, or just the last gasp before the people who are waving disappear beneath the waves? And I want to talk to you this afternoon about the way in which companies deal with change under conditions of stress, and some of the things that get in the way of companies dealing with change. Peter also told me that you're a very smart group of people, and looking at the companies and organisations represented in the room today, it looks to me that that's probably true. So let's just test that. I'm going to ask you two questions. I don't want to know the answer now, but I want to see who is smart, because when we get to the point in the presentation, I'd like you to tell me the answer. The first question is, why is Mohammed Bouazizi famous? And the second question is, in what year did the national newspaper industry in the UK go into decline, from which it's never recovered? So Mohammed Bouazizi, what's he famous for? Please don't Google it. And and what year did the national newspaper industry go into decline in the UK? You can Google that. Good luck with that one. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk a little bit about me and BMJ, but not for more than a minute. Incidentally, if I bore you this afternoon and your attention wanders, can I direct you to page 9 of the printed programme? There's some very profitable reading there for you if you're bored with what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about modern life and how bloody complicated it is. Hopefully that will resonate with you. Then, as I say, I'm going to talk about change and why companies find it so difficult. I ran The Guardian for 5 years at a time when the newspaper industry was going through, actually it still is, very, very, very intense pressures. And I have some reflections on that. Whether there are any parallels in your world is for you to decide. And then I'm going to give you my tips and hints, what I think, what I've found has worked in terms of managing people through that kind of turbulence. So, as Simon kindly said, I'm CEO of BMJ. He said currently. I find that a slightly disturbing word. I am, when I left the office this morning, I still was. In my spare time, as it were, I chair a business called the Knowledge Engineers, which is a company that trains marketers and advertising agency folk in digital technologies. Our biggest customers are the Internet Advertising Bureau, Google, WPP, and Omnicom. As Simon mentioned, the year in between The Guardian and BMJ, I was visiting fellow at London Business School, and it was during that time that I did a lot of talking to people in the media industry generally about the issues around change. I'm pleased to say that when I was running The Guardian, we won World's Best Online Newspapers 3 years there out of 4. New York Times got the one in between there. And very interesting work for the Cabinet Office. They're doing an extraordinary thing at the Cabinet Office. They are trying to transform all government services to digital by default. Martha Lane Fox wrote the strategy for digital government, digital citizenship, 2 years ago. A team was formed at the Cabinet Office to deliver on this. They now have sign-off and control over all government digital activity, and the changes that they're making are quite extraordinary, particularly given that we're talking obviously about a public sector organisation. And let's face it, public sector organisations don't always have a reputation for nimble adaptiveness. It just goes to show what you can do with a clear strategy and some talented people, and it's it's a great privilege to me to be part of that board. We've been around since 1840, one careful shareholder during that time, the British Medical Association. It is now a worldwide business. We have 300,000 customers globally. We have about 4 million users in 2012, readers, if you like. We work in 9 languages, everything from Brazilian Portuguese to Mandarin. And as you can see, some of the other stats there, a lot of business in the online learning field for doctors, and 21 million exam questions answered last year. Some very studious people among our readership. With the best read journal, of course, in the UK, but of course, no surprises, our digital audience now massively exceeds our print audience. And here you can see the way in which the company has changed over a 10-year period from a print business to a digital business. I claim, obviously, no credit for that. I arrived at the end of last year, so happy to be associated with the top bit, and it's up to us now to take that to 90. And also, happily, we're not dependent on the UK. Depending on the National Health Service for anything apart from A&E is a pretty dark and lonely business. And as you can see there, I hope you can see there, over the last 5 years, our business in North America has grown at a compound rate of about 6%. Our business in the rest of the world has grown at a compound rate of 11 to 12%. So it's actually export that's driving our business. And in fact, just right now, we're opening offices in Brazil, in New Jersey. We're staffing up in the Middle East and in India, because that's where the growth in our business is. Enough about that. Let's talk about modern life. A friend of mine does quite a lot of consulting work for this organisation, the African Development Bank. Some of you may know it. It's a transnational, non-governmental organisation that is dedicated to channeling funds into infrastructure projects to improve the standard of living in Africa. And it was founded shortly after the Second World War, and it was based for a long time in Abidjan, the capital of the Côte d'Ivoire. It's a francophone institution. They have a policy, which is all of their staff are African. So they employ, obviously, economists, social scientists, statisticians, accountants, the people you'd expect in a development bank. And there they were in Abidjan, and they became increasingly unhappy about being there because, of course, Côte d'Ivoire was subject to a rather dreadful civil war. So they decided they needed to move. Now, you'd think, wouldn't you, that that's a pretty straightforward task for the African Development Bank, staffed entirely with African social scientists, economists, etc., etc., etc. And their criteria for their new home were fairly simple. They wanted a francophone country for obvious reasons. It needed good transport links to the West because they were used to a lot of inbound visitors from places like the United Nations. Personally, they wanted a place with good schools. They needed good hotels to put those important visitors up in. And most particularly, given their experience in the Côte d'Ivoire, they wanted a stable environment. So Mohamed Bouazizi? Yes. Tunisia? Yes. So in September 2010, they moved to Tunis. And in December 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire because his fruit that he was selling had been confiscated by policemen, and that was the trigger for the Arab Spring. And by January 2011, the regime in Tunisia had been overthrown. I like that story because what it tells you is a group of extremely expert people who were making a decision that directly affected their own personal well-being, as well as that of the institution with which they were associated, made a profound error because they couldn't predict the future. And the news is, none of us can. So I just think that it's important to remember that life is complicated. And I like this diagram because I think it sums up certainly how I feel about life. If you feel differently, I'd love to meet you at the drinks reception this evening, and you can tell me about how your life is slowing down and how you're not being required to be flexible in the way that you work, and how the number of variables that you deal with in your work are diminishing week by week, and how you're finding that decisions made over here have no impact on things that are happening over here, and how you find that actually there's nothing new going on in your market, and there's no technology changes driving decision making, there's no new competitors, etc., etc. I'd love to meet you. I haven't yet met anybody who would describe their work in that way, and that's a challenge for us all, because the one thing that does stay the same, I think, or at least for those of us who work in the for-profit sector, is that our shareholders require us to make a profit every year, and they prefer it quite strongly if that profit grows every year. That doesn't seem to change, but everything else does change. Some of you will be familiar with agile development. A lot of technology development programs are now using agile. And I like this definition. This is the Wikipedia definition of agile as a development process. But the reason I like it is nothing to do with technology. It just seems to me that that describes very crisply what it feels like to be a manager today. So you're running a complex, high-speed, self-correcting venture during which people interact in search of a desirable result in conditions of high change and high stress. It's nothing to do with the tech department. I think that's just management today. And accordingly, I give you my hero. Anybody know who that is? Come on, you're so smart, allegedly. The quote is actually a translation. The gentleman is French. He's Voltaire. And that really is my slogan. I think he was talking there about the existence of God. But in my view, that applies to most circumstances where you're being asked to find a yes/no answer to something. I always get very nervous when people say it's totally clear that we should be doing X, or those people are absolutely wrong to be doing what they're doing. They must be crazy. We were talking about such a person earlier on. I think in the circumstances in which we work, where things are changing so fast and so unpredictably, certainty is a very dangerous thing to have. And that's very difficult when you're running a team of people who want to know what they can hang on to. It's very difficult. So as I said, I spent some time at London Business School, and it's interesting. I thought I wanted to be a teacher when I was a kid, and fortunately, I got a job in my gap year teaching French at a prep school, and I realised that I didn't want to be a teacher, and it's just as well that I had that learning early. But the difference between 12-year-olds who don't want to be in a classroom and 30-year-olds who've paid to be in a classroom out of their own money is very, very profound. And it was very, very interesting teaching at London Business School, but it was also interesting for the way in which it gave me access to lots of people to talk to them and understand about their businesses as well as my own. So I just want to talk to a few points as to why I think change is so hard. Many of you will be familiar with the saying that the Queen thinks the world smells of fresh paint. For foreign visitors, the Queen is the lady on the left of that picture. And of course, the reason people say that is if the Queen never goes anywhere unplanned. People are always forewarned that she's going to be visiting. And of course, people put their best front forward when the Queen is visiting. So everything gets cleaned, everything gets painted, and the idea is the Queen just thinks that fresh paint is what the world smells of. And the problem with this, I think, is not confined to the royal family. Indeed, I was reading with interest the report of the Public Accounts Committee, which is one of the finer public bodies in this country, who've just been looking at the Department of Work and Pensions Universal Credit scheme that they're allegedly bringing in next month. Look out for that. And it's not going to work, although the Secretary of State stood up in Parliament after the report was published and said it is going to work, so that'll be interesting. One of them's wrong there, I can be certain about that. And one of the key reasons that they said it wasn't going to work, there were two really. The first reason is they'd embarked on building this technology solution without specifying what it was that they wanted it to actually deliver. So £341 million later, they're not sure whether they've built something that's fit for purpose. But the second reason was the good news culture in the department. And the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions was able to stand up and say with a straight face, I had no idea that these bad things were happening in my department because nobody told me. And I believe him. I believe him. And how terrible is that? from my own experience, I used to be a director of a subsidiary of Time Warner, and once a year normally, the CEO of Time Warner, Jeff Bewkes, comes over on the private jet, nothing so vulgar as first class on a commercial plane, and he reviews the businesses in London. And if you think about Time Warner, all of their businesses are present in London in a big way. You know, Warner Brothers, CNN, etc., etc. And you get an hour with him to tell him how things are going in your business. And if you think about that hour, do you use that hour to tell him all of your troubles and woes? No, you don't. If you're us, you rehearsed within an inch of your life 59.5 minutes of extremely slick PowerPoint and speech about how brilliantly everything's going, Jeff. Thank you very much. And so we used to do that, and he is a man who says very little, and he'd ask a few very good questions, and then he'd say, thanks very much for your time, see you again, and he'd go back on his plane. And I always used to think, does he actually have somebody who whispers in his ear, Jeff, you do realise their business is absolutely fucked, don't you? Or not? And I worked there for 5 years without ever actually knowing the answer to that question, and I hope that he does. I still have a soft spot for Time Warner, but maybe he's like Ian Duncan Smith, and actually thinks everything really is okay. So that's one of the first problems I think that organisations encounter, is that stuff that's causing difficulty gets filtered out as it goes further up the organisation. I talked to a lot of people who were very rueful about this. People who'd spent 25 or 30 years climbing to the top of quite greasy poles to get to a position of authority. And then they were finding that structures and skills that had served them during that elevation were no longer the most pertinent or important structures and skills for their organisation. And getting people at the top of a pole to vote that it should be chopped down and replaced with something else is quite challenging. People have a vested interest in things staying as they are, so they tend not to hear the bad news. The other real challenge, I think, for what we must call legacy businesses that were around in the 20th century, is that increasingly you need digital natives. You need the skills of people who are now in their 20s or early 30s. And actually, when they come into those environments, they often find that those environments are not very welcoming or sympathetic. I remember the guy who built the iPhone and iPad app for The Guardian, worked for me, John. He was in his 20s, brilliant guy, really talented engineer and a very great project manager and award-winning app builder. And he came to me one day and he said, look, I'm really sorry, but I've just been offered a job at Skype running the iOS platform globally. I said, why are you apologising? He said, well, I feel really awful about leaving you in the lurch, but you know, it's Skype and they're paying me twice as much as you're paying me. And those are some of the challenges that we have in the space where digital talent is, that it's competed for not just by those digital native firms, who of course are very alluring to people with those skills, but increasingly we're competing for, say, a mobile developer. We might want to put some of our stuff onto mobile. Well, actually, so do Lloyd's TSB want to put their stuff onto mobile. And guess what? They pay more than we do. Their view of the mobile development expense is it's a pinprick in their turnover. So if they, let's pay 150 grand to that guy to come in and do that, they don't think twice about it. I think most people in this room would think more than twice about paying someone 150 grand to do anything. So there's a real challenge around attracting skills in. And what you see in a lot of businesses is this horrible yo-yo effect where you go, we need to get some people in. They get people in. It doesn't work. The people leave. And then they go, okay, now what we're doing is we're going to train everybody. We're going to train everybody. Everybody's going to be digital. And they try that for a couple of years, and there's lots of training sessions, some of them even in places as warm as this. And that doesn't work, and then they go back to getting some people in, and you just have this constant left foot, right foot kind of dance going on. This is a gentleman called Stephen Pax Leonard. Great name. Pax, nice middle name, I think. And He's got a rather distinct specialty. He specialises in Inuit dialects. It's not a big field. He's the man. He's the go-to guy for Inuit dialects. And his view, he's lived among the Inuit all his adult life. And his view is that Inuit have known about climate change since the 60s. And the reason that they've known is that they depend on the ice. They don't just depend on it. Their lives literally depend on the ice. And they've known that the climate is changing because the way the ice behaves has been changing all that time. But he makes the point, nobody listens to them. There are no Inuit spokesmen to stand up and preach this problem. And when you think about it, actually, even quite important people like, say, the Vice President of the United States, former Mr. Gore, and he stands up and preaches about it, and nobody really listens to him either. But I like this image of the Inuit because it resonated with me in terms of what normally happens when something bad starts to happen to your business, is the people who feel it first are at the front line. And often, I think, what happens in that case is you get a kind of grumpy conversation at head office which goes, that guy in Scotland just keeps missing his bloody sales figures, doesn't he? Every month now, for 6 months, he's missed that target. Let's fire him and get someone decent in. Whereas a more constructive approach might be, let's get him down here and understand what the problem is. And actually, I used to work for a company called EMAP, which doesn't really exist anymore, but it was a good company at the time. And they exemplified the opposite of this approach. They had a lot of regional newspapers. It was back in the 80s. And they noticed that their display advertising revenue was dropping in their regional newspapers. They got the salespeople, and instead of giving them a right old telling off, they said, what's the problem? You're all good at your job. What's the problem? And they said, local radio. We're just losing share to local radio every week. They seem to be really good at selling. People like to advertise on their stations. What did EMAP do? Sold their regional newspapers, put all the money into local radio, and became the second largest commercial radio business in the UK. So that's people paying attention to those signals at the periphery instead of just blaming people for not performing. This one's a Lulu. I love this figure. It's a confected figure, but on average, the Guardian goes to press, the print copy of the Guardian goes to press just after 10 o'clock on a weekday. And on average, if it's late, it costs the Guardian £15 a second from the minute you miss the deadline. It's £15 a second clocking up. Now, imagine how much attention is focused in that organisation, or indeed any national newspaper, on not being late to press. And all of that attention is not available for talking about where are we going to be in 3 years' time. The forces that force you just to keep your nose buried in the day-to-day business that you're managing, whether or not it's going like that or going like that, are incredibly strong. And wresting your attention away from those forces to look beyond today is very, very hard. And the company makes it hard because the money that you're making is made today. It isn't made in 3 years' time or 3 months' time. There are lots and lots of forces militating in favour of the present. I nicked this diagram actually off a lady called Scilla Snowball, great name, who's chairman of AMVB BDO. They're the biggest creative agency in the UK. And she's been either CEO or chairman for 15 years now. And they've been the biggest creative agency in the UK right through that time. And she's very fond of this chart and was very happy for me to nick it because back in the dot-com bubble days, do you remember those? Some of you will, 2000, 2001, everybody was going, aha, we're hopeless. We're old, old media. We need to set up a new media company because we'll just get completely destroyed by digital. And lots of companies did that, and they hived people off or into some trendy place in somewhere like Shoreditch, Clerkenwell, and said, okay, off you go. She resisted all of that, and they were saying, we could do what other agencies done. We could find a digital agency that's really got all these cool kids in and sort of move them into the building so that some of it will rub off, hopefully. But actually what she did from day one was she said, we're not going to do any of that. If you're right that this is important, we are actually all going to learn how to be digital people. So she's never had a separate department. She's never had a separate company doing that. It's been all along, we have got to master these skills. But the point she would make, and I completely agree with her, is that there is no single right answer to that structural issue about how to deal with change. I read recently a very good piece by a guy called Kevin Anderson, who used to work at bbc.co.uk, American, very smart blogger. And he was saying, if you're going to make a transition to the new, in this case digital, you have to do this. He said, and the only people who've succeeded are people who've done it in a separate company. And he gave some good examples, and then I thought about some examples that I could think of from my own experience. And the Daily Telegraph in 2007, I think it was, they sent their editor to Harvard Business School, very dangerous thing to do. And when he came back, he said, aha, I've read the book, we've got to do it separately. And they gave him £40 million, an office in Euston, so it was called Project Euston. Their offices are in Victoria, so it's physically quite a long way from their offices, and they gave him £40 million, and they went, off you go. And £40 million later, he exited, and they had nothing. They were left with nothing. Now that was bad, but not as bad as my own personal experience, because EMAP, in 2000, they were doing this. Separate division in each of their companies, and they said, we're not moving fast enough. We need to do that. And so I got a call one day from the chief executive who said, oh, good news, we want you to be the operations director of that. And I said, you're joking, right? And they said, no, this is completely serious, this is the future. So we all went there, and in the space of a year, we got through a year's profits of EMAP PLC, and 2 years later, EMAP PLC had ceased to exist. So that was a fairly big mistake. So the point is, there are lots of different gambits available to you structurally, and there's no guarantee that any one of them will work. And I could think of companies that have tried all 5, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but it's complicated. This is an example, actually it's a very famous London Business School case study, and it's about the language that people use and how people can be trapped by their own language. Back in the day, Campbell's was one of the 2 big soup brands in the UK. And of course, as you all being sagacious people will know, that's not actually a Campbell's soup tin, that's an Andy Warhol painting, because Campbell's is such a famous brand that he chose it for one of his paintings. And then these guys came along, the New Covent Garden Soup Company, and launched in the UK. Many of us will have eaten their provender. And the Campbell's board had a look at this. Oh, new company, we'd better have a look at these guys. And they decided that what they needed to do about the New Covent Garden Soup Company was nothing. Because they were in the wet soup business. And Campbell's were in the dry soup business. So there was no competitive issue. That sounds very funny, but it's true. It's true. And as a result, Campbell's went out of business in the UK. And the point is that the language they used was their internal language. Who here ever asks in a restaurant, have you got any wet soup? Of course, the reason they called it wet soup was, as you know, to make Campbell's soup, you take the lid off the tin, you drop the contents into a pan, you fill the tin with water, and then you mix them in the pan. But they were so imprisoned by their own language that they couldn't actually see that a consumer doesn't give 2 hoots about their market definitions. To bring it a bit closer to home, some of you will remember, I think, because it actually became quite famous before it crashed and burned, an organisation called Fish 4. Does anyone remember Fish 4? So Fish for Jobs, Fish for Cars, Fish for Homes. And what happened, and the thinking was excellent, right? The strategic thinking was excellent, The regional newspaper companies, of course, enjoyed local monopolies in those three big classifieds, and that's been the profit source for regional newspapers since they were invented. And they looked at digital and they thought, blimey, it is going to move to digital at some pace or other, and we're all going to end up building classified advertising platforms at what was then huge expense. But hang on a minute, we don't actually compete with each other. You know, the Manchester Evening News doesn't compete with the Liverpool Post and Echo. So why are we all building our own classified platform? We could form a joint company, and then it would be fantastic because we'd have all of the big regionals on one platform, and it would be a category killer. It would be brilliant. So they did that. They formed a joint company. 5 out of the 6 major regional newspaper companies came together and built this Fish 4 brand. And actually, a year after launch, it was the most recognised digital brand in the UK, believe it or not, talking back at the end of the last century. And it all went horribly wrong for them for the simple reason, again, about the way they thought about their business. Because they thought about their business as the Manchester Evening News, the Liverpool Post and Echo. Now, if you stop and think about that for a moment, if you think about somebody who's in the market for a used car and has a budget of £5,000, are they going to confine their search to Manchester because that's where they live, or will they drive the 40 minutes down the motorway to Liverpool if they can save £500 by doing so? They're going to drive, right? And into that market came Auto Trader, which was also a print brand, half owned by The Guardian. And what they very simply did was, we're not interested in where you live. We're not interested in the towns that divide this country up. You just tell us how far you're prepared to travel, and we'll show you all the cars that we know about within. So you choose 5 miles, 50 miles, 500 miles, you choose. Their share of the classified car market now in digital is about 95%. And that joint venture completely collapsed, partly because the publishers couldn't stand each other. I'm sure that's not true in this organisation, but the regional newspapers, they just couldn't stand being in the same room as each other, could be barely civil, and partly because their view of the market was absolutely confined to the past and how they defined it for another purpose, and they missed the point of digital as a result. My last point on this topic of why change is so hard is about metrics. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I just scraped through my maths O-level, but I do understand this formula, P0 is greater than P1, and it's a very, very beguiling situation, and it's why you must always be very wary about your finance director, because she or he will tend to sneer at new entrants and go, I pulled their accounts from Companies House yesterday. Does your finance director talk like that? And do you know what? They only made 100 grand last year. Nothing. We don't need to worry about them. And it's very, very beguiling, because the established business is always going to be making more than the new business, P1, until such time as P1 overtakes it. And you just need to be very careful when you're looking at people coming new into your market that you're not just lazily applying your own measures of success to what they're doing. BMJ makes a very healthy, large profit. The knowledge engineers, whom I mentioned earlier, when they broke £100,000 profit, which to their clients is nothing, we had a big drink, because the previous year we'd made nothing. So £100,000 was a huge deal for that company, and of course, as night follows day, it then became £200,000. But be very, very careful when you're looking at new entrants into your market that you're not dismissing them because they don't conform to your measures of success, because almost invariably they will not. They will have their own idea of what success looks like. And one of the challenging things in this arena now is that increasingly, with VC money washing around the world, a lot of the entrants into markets aren't actually looking to make a profit. They're looking to make a profit by exiting and selling the business on to a different investor. So even a company that's loss-making may be a threat in your market, even if your finance director doesn't think they're doing very well. So let's talk about the hunt for answers to these conundrums about the way in which technology is changing our business. And forgive me, I'm going to talk about an industry that I have some direct personal experience of, but hopefully you will have reasonable experience of it, because hopefully you're all consumers of news, at least, if not these days necessarily of newspapers. And the UK has the most competitive national press market of any developed country in the world. And there's a reason for that, which is that we were kind of first in. There was a very favourable confluence of events in the early Victorian era, which was the growth in the economy due to the Industrial Revolution, the building of the railway network due to that growth in the economy. That itself reinforced the growth in the economy. That's St Pancras Station, of course, which at the time it was built was the world's largest roof, and it's still rather a good roof. And coinciding with that growth in the economy, a growth in literacy, because the country could afford to keep its kids in school until they're a little bit older, so more of them could read. And because a lot of them had jobs, they had some money. All that came together to create the national newspaper industry, because suddenly you could print a newspaper in one city and it'd be on sale the following day right across the country. And here's my paper of choice, and that's the first issue of the Manchester Guardian. Anyone here from Manchester? Hooray! Hello. Go Manchester. Speaking of the royal family, my favourite letter I received, you get some quite strange letters when you're running something like the Guardian, as you might imagine. My favourite was from the Prince of Wales, inviting me to an event in the Lake District that he was hosting, and it was addressed to the managing director of the Manchester Guardian. That name was dropped in 1960. And something tells me that the Guardian is not his paper of choice. But anyway, but this is the first issue from April 1821. And the interesting thing about this issue is that there you have on that page the business model for national newspapers, and it's the same today, hasn't changed one little bit. You've got a cover price, which, as I hope you can see, is 7 pence. It was very high, and the reason it was high is that 6 of those 7 pence was tax, because the government really hated newspapers. Nothing much changed in that respect over the years, and they were trying to tax them to death. And in fact, what would happen in Manchester was that a street would buy one copy and pass it from house to house, and it was weekly in those days, and by the end of the week everyone would have read it and the new issue would be out. Then you've got classified advertising. This one is a property ad for the messuage or dwelling house, outhouses and premises of the late John Wardle, so house for sale. And then you've got display advertising. I think we can agree that people like Abbott Mead Vickers, BBDO, have done a bit to move the display advertising discipline on since 1821. Display ads look a bit better these days, but that's for Sun Life Assurance Society, money off their premiums, so hurry on down, buy your insurance while stocks last. And there used to be, and there probably still is, a lot of angst at The Guardian, particularly among the journalists, about what was happening to the newspaper industry, understandably, because of course their jobs depended on it. And I used to say, look, this business model's been thriving since the 1820s. We shouldn't be surprised perhaps if the wheels start to drop off at this point, because there are many industries that don't have a lifespan of anything approaching that length. And the point is, of course, that what's happened is that digital has just pulled that business model completely to pieces. People don't expect to pay for news anymore. Classified advertising vehicles such as Rightmove and Auto Trader have nicked the classifieds, and display advertisers now have an incredible array of choice, not least people like Google and Facebook to choose from. They don't need newspapers in the way that they used to. I rather like this cartoon because this could be me and my teenage daughter. I'm sorry if you can't read it, I'll read it for you. The guy is saying, breaking news! Newspapers are planning to put all their stories about newspapers using paywalls behind a paywall. And the daughter is saying, what's a newspaper? And there is, sadly, a complete divide in developed societies like the UK, where people under about 30 just don't buy newspapers. They don't buy them, they don't read them. So even if newspapers are still around, they won't be around in the future because those people will get older, and they won't, as they get older, suddenly acquire a hitherto unsuspected yearning to buy the Daily Telegraph. So what you've seen is that frightening, hectic development that happens in an industry that's shrinking and that knows that the end is coming. And all sorts of weird things happen in industries when that goes on. And it's a very interesting thing to watch. And I think it's always a measure of the health of an industry to reflect on, is everybody doing the same thing, or are people doing different things? Because you couldn't get a more healthily competitive industry than the national newspaper industry. And they're doing very different things. So the Times is behind a paywall, and of course the Guardian is free. Utterly divergent strategies. The Guardian, as a result, has grown its readership massively. Now, whether it can monetize that readership or not is entirely moot at this point, but you can see the numbers there for yourselves. It's gone from 4 million in print to 10.5 million in total because of its free digital channels. And the Times, instead of adding 150%, has added 5% to its reach because everything's behind a paywall. I don't know which of those strategies is right, but I do know that's a signal for a really healthy industry where people aren't just zigging. You've got zigging and zagging going on, people trying different things. That's genuinely competitive. And just in case you think I've got a downer on News Corporation, which I don't, I think it's interesting to think about the different responses available to you depending on the kind of company that you are. Because at the single company level, you can be strategically agile or not. As I've been saying, I hope you've gathered, it's very difficult to be strategically agile. But I think a brilliant example of that is Sky. They haven't just done the obvious stuff like go into providing your broadband and your phone alongside your cable TV, or satellite, I should say, TV subscription. They've done the slightly less obvious, because when they saw things like Netflix and Love Film coming along, they thought, actually, that's really dangerous what those people are doing. So what they've done is they've untethered their subscriber. So, of course, you can now watch Sky on your tablet on the train in the morning, should you so choose. That's not a small thing for them to have decided to do. It's a huge change to their business model, and it's very high risk. But I admire that because I think they're demonstrating strategic agility within their company. But News Corp is an example of what you can do at the portfolio level. So a big holding company like WPP, or in this case News Corporation, and of course they've done a very, very big thing, which is they've said, actually, the pressures on our print business are so intense and particular that we're actually going to split News Corporation into two. So you've now got Fox, film and TV business, and floating shortly the new News Corp business. Apparently the logo is based on Rupert's own handwriting, which much neater than mine, I have to say. And that allows those two sets of executives to manage the two rather different challenges of film and print in different, completely different companies. And then even within that print portfolio, if you look at what Murdoch has done, and he's nothing if not somebody who's prepared to take a risk, he introduced different paywall strategies in each of the three major capitals that he publishes in. So the strategy introduced in New York is different from London and is different from Sydney. And he just did that because he can. And then he can see which of those three works, and presumably the one that works best will get rolled out in time to the other two cities. So it's much easier to be agile, if you like, if you're holding assets in different companies. It's very challenging, but doable, to be agile within a single business if you're prepared to take a risk and be bold. Okay, so how are we doing for time? We're doing all right. I just want to finish by talking about some things that I reflected on, I guess, talking to all those people who'd been trying to manage media businesses through the last 10 years of very, very hectic change. And I'll share them with you. This is actually a quote from, you're going to think I spend all my time browsing philosophy books, but I don't actually. This is by Emerson, the American 19th century philosopher. And he said there are always two parties, the party of the past and the party of the future, the establishment and the movement. And certainly in my experience, that's true within any company. I don't read Amazon. I do read Gary Hamel, a very brilliant business strategist, and he wrote that in the Harvard Business Review in July 1996 in a piece called Strategy as Revolution, which I recommend heartily to you. It's my favorite essay about strategy. It's 10 pages long. You can download it for $5 from the HBR website, or you can Google it. It's your choice. The point about the movement is it's always a smaller group of people than the establishment, and they are often in surprising places in the business. When I was running The Guardian, myself and the editor used to do something which we found very fruitful, which is that once a week we would have a breakfast. The national newspaper tends to get moving at about 10 o'clock in the morning, but we'd have a breakfast at 8:30, free croissant, and we'd just say, Tuesday morning, breakfast, open meeting, we're going to talk about the effect of digital technology on our sports coverage or our politics coverage or whatever. And the only person we'd mandate to be there would be the editor of the relevant section. So we'd say to the sports editor, you need to be there. But apart from that, it's just an open invitation. And it would be really interesting because you get between 30 and 50 people giving their time, coming in, and they'd be from all different parts of the company. And some of them would have amazingly insightful and interesting things to say. Somebody from the accounts department or somebody from the classified advertising sales team. And the sports editor would be going, well, that's really interesting. And you began to get a sense of who in the company really wanted to move things on, who had an open mind about how we did things, who was prepared to change. And then, of course, if you were the editor, you were also thinking, who in my sports team couldn't be asked, excuse my French, to turn up to this breakfast meeting about the future of our sports coverage? Well, they're obviously not in the party of the future. And that's interesting for their relationship with the editor. So I do believe it's important to get all functions involved and enthused about the opportunities that new technology brings, and not just senior people either. Junior people often have as much to bring because they are users of this technology. It's also important to push the disciplines together. The single best thing we did at The Guardian was move buildings because we were able to put the tech dev team right next to the news desk, which in the old building we were in, we're not able to do physically. And that was completely transformative because they suddenly started talking to each other and new things began to happen as a result of those functions being pushed together. Really important to get people in from the outside. It's very, very dangerous in any company that you fall into groupthink. You think that what you're doing is smart. You think that what you're doing is obvious, natural, logical. It may be, but it's always interesting to get someone in from outside who does things differently, has different experiences. And you can't talk enough. As things change, people get anxious. Stress comes from people experiencing change of which they're not in control. And you can help them with that by just, A, talking to them about what you're doing, and B, allowing them to talk to you about what they think about it. Remember WIFM. WIFM is an acronym, what's in it for me. People don't actually come to work to make a profit for you. They come to work because they derive something themselves from it. Hopefully, they derive more than simply their wage from it. I'm sure that in most of the businesses in this room, that's true. People are coming in because they're interested in what the enterprise is doing, but you have to give them reasons why what you're changing is going to help them or be good for them. Another great writer on business is Charles Handy. Some of you will know Charles Handy. And he said a very powerful line, which is, you should treat any organization, should treat its staff as volunteers. And I chair a charity, and most of the work from that charity is done by volunteers. And the lady who runs the charity, she does three very simple things. She explains to those volunteers as they start work very clearly what it is that she needs them to do. So it's very clear. She also tells them at whatever length they wish why she's asking them to do what she's asking them to do, not just what, but why. And she will talk for as long as they like about that until they're satisfied, because they're giving their time. And then the third thing, at the end, when they've finished, is she thanks them and throws a party and says, thank you very much, everybody, that was completely brilliant. And it's no different, I think, with staff. You just need to tell them what it is you want them to do, why you want them to do it, and thank them for doing it. Very, very simple. I often forget to do one, at least, of those three things. Perhaps some of you do too. Listening as well as talking, always good. And the rule of 5, this is from psychology. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the rule of 5, which is, there's a gentleman whose name escapes me who writes about this, and he reckons that he can tell from listening to a married couple talk for 20 minutes about their last holiday together, he can tell you whether their marriage is going to survive or not, because he applies the rule of 5. And the rule of 5 is, if there are 5 or more positive elements to the communication to every one negative, that's a good marriage. If there are fewer than 5, it's probably not going to last. So if they go, oh God, the breakfast in that hotel was rubbish, and then they laugh and they go, yes, but dinner was great, or that boat trip was memorable. If you've got 5 of those positives to every negative, you're going to be okay. And it's the same with your staff. Give them lots of love. You have to tell them when they're doing something wrong, but give them lots of positives so that when you tell them something's wrong, is not rupturing the relationship. And look after them. You know, the poor devils spend more time with you than they spend probably with anybody else in their life. Well, certainly in most companies that's true. And you should look after them because they deserve it. But the important thing that people often forget in that process is also when you're going through the times of change and managing other people's stress and other people's needs, people often forget to look after themselves. There you have a lovely equilateral triangle. Sadly, in my experience, the work point of that triangle often pulls the other two out. And it may be, in some cases, that it's your family or your loved ones who suffer as a result of that. But I often see people, and people who work for me, where they go out of their way to make sure that they're not disserving their loved ones, and they completely neglect themselves, and they work themselves completely out to exhaustion. So please, if you remember one thing from this talk, it's that you are just as important as anybody else in that triangle, and I hope you look after yourselves. And thank you very much for listening.
I don't know if you want to take any questions, if there are any questions.
Happy to
from the
take
audience.
questions or points. Sorry, I didn't ask. The year that national newspaper market went into decline, was that going to be your point? Go.
The 30s?
No.
20s?
No.
Is
Just
it a
shouting
trick
out a
question?
random decades, not
trick
really
question?
answering the question. I can do that. Sorry? 1960. No. Oh, shall I tell you? No, I'll tell you the year, and then somebody really smart can tell me why. 1956. Why? Yes, ITV launched. That was the year that sales of national newspapers peaked in the UK, never recovered since because of television. But the point was that for all those decades after that, up until about 2007, everybody was kind of going, oh, it's kind of okay, it's kind of okay. And then suddenly, oh my God, oh no, it's not okay. We may not be here in 5 years' time. So when the decline starts, it's often easy to kid yourself that it's nothing particularly serious. And we're only losing 2 points a year. We'll be here for another 50 years. Any questions?
So
Yes, sir.
Essentially related to what you're saying, do you see any future for print journalists going forward?
So I actually do have a daughter who's a teenager. She's 19, and she informed me when she was in sixth form that she wanted to do journalism degree. And I have to say, I talked her out of it because I think that there are just some areas of work that dwindle and disappear. Typesetting, for example, you don't get that anymore. and journalism, I think, is a threatened endeavour. I mean, she wants to work in fact, she was in our business doing work experience last week, making videos for our learning team. So she's very interested in the communications industry, but I think journalism is it's just a shrinking. Look, there's no part of this that makes me feel good. But while I was running The Guardian, we went from 900 journalists to 500 journalists, and in doing that, we were merely exemplifying a trend. Any other questions? Yes, sir, at the back.
So, based on your experience with talking with the Time Warner CEO,
Yeah.
how do you encourage your own staff? How do you encourage your own staff to give you the straight news? The good news and the bad news.
I just beg them to do that. I beg them to do that. It's also, I mean, it's a very difficult thing when you're someone like him because, you know, he's running such a vast organisation, and I suppose one of the many lovely things about BMJ is that it is if you put the time in, you can actually get a grip on most of what's going on yourself. So when someone tells you something, you can either think that sounds right, or I'm having smoke blown here. But I think it's one of the things I do, because I think it's a really important thing. When people join the company, I have breakfast every month, free breakfast. It works in my experience. And one of the things I say to people is, I want to know from you if you think something's not going right in this organisation, because we're not here to do things wrong. We're here to do things right. So I say to people, my door's open, or you can email me, or actually I have an email on the intranet which is anonymous, so that I can't tell who sent the email. I just receive them. And if I beg people to tell me if things are going wrong. Not, I hasten to add, because I think our company's littered with horrible secrets, but it's just an important part of the culture, I think, that people are prepared to go, actually, we've done that wrong. Other questions? No?
I have a question.
Go.
So, what do you think of the owner of the largest, well, the CEO of the largest online retailer, which has never made a profit, I don't believe, buying the Washington Post?
I think he's too late. This is Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, who's just bought the Washington Post for $250 million, which I think he's worth about $15 billion, Jeff Bezos, so it's kind of, you know, it's instead of his annual holiday sort of thing. I went to see the Washington Post in 2009, and they just hired the editor of the Wall Street Journal in the hope that he was going to kind of digitize the Post, and he was at his wit's end. The WashingtonPost.com was in a different building from the Washington Post. They didn't speak to each other. The news desk at the Post, still in 2009, right, thought it was cool to hold stuff back for the print edition, so they wouldn't tell their colleagues on the digital news desk that they had a great story, because you're on a need-to-know basis, right, and you don't need to know. And this was even after their entire... Did anyone see House of Cards, Kevin Spacey thing? And the slug line in the House of Cards, that's Politico.com. And that was the entire politics desk of the Washington Post, which, when you think about that paper, is the most important desk in the paper. They just upped and set up in competition because they were so hacked off with the company's inability to get with digital that they thought, oh, that's fine, we can do this ourselves. And actually they did. And you don't need very much money to set up a web, obviously. What they're now doing, hilariously, is they're now producing a newspaper which they just sell inside the Beltway, which is doing really quite well. So obviously Jeff Bezos is a genius, and even a genius, I don't think, can rescue the Washington Post. But I'd be wrong to be certain about that, wouldn't I? It'd be ridiculous to be certain. So maybe he can. Maybe he can. We'll see.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any more last questions?
I'm going to rudely leave now because I have to make some phone calls, but I will be back and I'll be around this evening, so I'd love to chat to any of you if you wish. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tim.